Hi Year 4 and welcome to Maths. I just wanted to go through a PowerPoint with you today, ready for your work that's on the website for tenths and hundredths and their relationship. So have a little look at this grid down here. So we have 100 squares. I know this because I can count 10 across the top here and I can count 10 down here. I know that 10 times 10 is 100. So we have a 100 square there. Each little square is 1 out of 100. So if I coloured one of those squares in, it's going to be 1 out of 100. And it represents the fraction of 1/100th. Each column, so that's the up and down, is 1 out of 10 because there are 10 columns across my square. So one column is 1 out of 10 columns and represents the fraction of 1/10. The columns and rows can also be represented as 10 out of 100 because in each column or row there are 10 little squares. So I can have my column or row as being 1 out of 10 columns and rows, or they can represent 10 little squares out of 100. So that's 10 100ths. Okay, have a little look at this grid and we're going to complete the sentences below to match the grid. So there are, how many squares shaded? Well, I know that each of those rows represent 10. So I'm just going to count them. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 rows of 10. So that's 10, 20, 30, 40 squares in total because there are 10 squares in each row. So there are 40 squares shaded out of 100 squares. This represents 40 100ths because 40 little squares out of 100 little squares are coloured in. There are actually also 4 rows shaded out of 10. So can you see that? I have 1 row, 2 rows, 3 rows, 4 rows out of all 10 rows. So it also represents 4/10ths. So this represents 40 little squares out of 100, 40 100ths, but also 4 rows out of 10 rows, so 4/10ths. Let's look at this one then. Looks a little bit different to me. Let's have a look. I have 2 full columns shaded in, and I know there's 10 little squares in each column. Then I've got some part columns, so let's have a look. I've got 10, 20, and I'm going to count the individual squares: 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. Okay, so I have 26 squares shaded out of all 100 squares. This represents 26 100ths. Okay, have a little think here. This is one for you to do. Pause the video if you need to. So choose the correct fraction to match the statement. How do you know you have chosen the correct one? So on my 100 square, I have 5 rows that have been shaded plus 4 extra squares. So 5 rows and 4 extra squares. So think about how many little squares there are in my 5 rows. So is my answer 45/10ths? Is it 45 100ths? Is it 54 100ths? Or is it 54/10ths? Have a little think. That's right, it's 54 tenths. It has to be this one, as 5 rows of 10 give us 50 little squares, don't they? And if you add on the 4 extra little squares, that gives you 54 out of 100. So 54 100ths. And here they are represented for you. So you have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 54 of those 100 little squares coloured in. Go back to that. I thought I was explaining it then, and I forgot I took that slide out to explain it to you here. So we have 3 whole rows or columns, don't we? Because we know in those 3 whole rows or columns we have got 30. So out of 10 whole rows and columns we have got 3 of them coloured in. And then we look at our ones number there, our 9. So we have 3 whole columns, and then we have 9 single squares coloured in. So I know that I've got 30, 9 100ths. That is the same as having 3 tenths, so 3 rows out of 10 rows coloured in, and 9 little squares, so 9 100ths. That gives me 39 100ths. Have a little go at these ones. You may want to pause the video before I explain. So 60 hundredths. So 60 over 100. How would we write that in these part whole models? I'll give you a clue. Notice that there's no ones in 60 hundredths. So that might give you a clue on why we have 2 part whole models to represent this. Hopefully you've had a little time to have a think. Let's have a look. So in the first one here, we've written it down as exactly how it's written, 60 hundredths. So we have 60 over 100. So that's 6 full rows of 10 little squares, because 6 times 10 is 60, coloured in. So if we're looking at in terms of tenths, we've coloured in 6 rows or columns out of the 10 rows or columns. So I have 6 tenths coloured in. I have 0 100ths in this one. We could look at that a slightly different way. So 60 over 100. I could ignore the fact that it's a tenth for now and just focus on how many little squares I've coloured in out of the 100 squares. I've probably coloured in 60 of them, haven't I? 60 little squares, because I've coloured 6 rows of 10 that we know from before. So I have 0 tenths this time and 60 100ths. So this can be represented in 2 ways, either as 6 tenths or 60 100ths, because they are equivalent. They are exactly the same as each other. Okay, 40 100ths then. Hopefully you've had a little go at this one. So 41 100ths, so 41 hundredths. There we go, so that's 41 out of 100. So this time I've coloured in 4 tenths because I have 40. That's 4 rows of 10 out of my whole 10 rows. 4 rows out of 10 rows coloured in. So I have 4 tenths. And then I have 1 left over, so I've got 1 little one coloured in, 1 100th. So 41 hundredths is made of 4 tenths and 1 100th. Okay, here's Mandeep, and she's explaining what this grid shows. Is she correct? So there are 2 rows and 3 extra squares shaded, which represents 23 tenths. Is she right or wrong? You might want to pause the video for a second, or as you have a little think. Well, she's actually incorrect, isn't she? There are 23 shaded whole squares, but that does not represent 23 tenths. It represents 23 hundredths. So it would be written as 23 over 100. So 23 hundredths. That's because I've got 2 whole rows of 10 there, which is 20 hundredths, or 2 tenths. And then 3 extra. So I can't have 2 tenths and 3 extra tenths, because it doesn't work, because those 3 are 3 out of a 100, aren't they? So I have 2 whole rows of 10 there, so that's 20. 3 out of 100. So 23 hundredths. Okay. Let's have a look at this one here. So this is our part whole model. This time we've got the 2 parts, but we don't have the whole. What is missing? I have 6 tenths and 7 hundredths. What could be missing? Well, it's 67 100ths, isn't it? 67 100ths of missing, because 6 tenths is represented by the 6 rows of 10 squares shaded. So that's your 6T. 6 rows of 10 squares shaded. So that makes 60 squares. And then I have my extra 7 hundredths there, which represents 7 individual squares shaded out of 100. So 60 add 7 is 67. So your answer should have been 67 hundredths. Okay, have a little go now at the sheets. Choose your challenge and give it a go. Good luck, Year 4.